Sometimes I wonder if there's a moment in every failed marriage where you can pinpoint exactly when things started falling apart. For me, it wasn't a dramatic fight or discovering some terrible secret. It was a single sentence that slipped out of my mouth at a party, and the way my husband's face changed when I said it. My name is Isla, and I'm 31 years old. I live in a small rental house in Nebraska now, but this story starts 4 years ago when I was married to Brooks and thought I had life figured out. We met at a community theater production where I was volunteering with costume design and he was doing sound tech. I remember being struck by how methodically he worked, testing every microphone twice, labeling every cable. There was something reassuring about his thoroughness in a world where I felt like everything was always shifting beneath my feet. Brooks was 28 then, working at a local credit union as a loan officer. He wasn't flashy or particularly ambitious in the way I thought I wanted, but he had this steady presence that drew me in. On our first date, we went to a minor league baseball game, and when it started drizzling in the 7th inning, he pulled out an umbrella he'd brought just in case. That's the kind of person he was always prepared, always thinking ahead, always making sure the people around him were comfortable. We dated for 2 years before getting married, and during that time, I convinced myself that his stability was exactly what I needed. I'd spent my early 20s bouncing between jobs and relationships, always searching for something that felt significant. Brooks represented security, and I thought that was what love looked like when you grew up. Our wedding was small and lovely, held at his family's farm outside town. His parents had been married for 35 years, and watching them dance at our reception, I felt this warm certainty that Brooks and I would have that same enduring partnership. We honeymooned in Colorado, hiking trails and staying in a cabin with no cell service, and for that week, I felt completely content with our simple life. We settled into a rhythm that first year. I worked as a freelance graphic artist, mostly designing flyers and business cards for local companies, while Brooks put in his steady 40 hours at the credit union. We rented a duplex with a little garden, and Brooks spent weekends teaching me how to grow tomatoes and herbs. I'd watch him carefully stake the plants and explain which ones needed more water, and I'd think about how lucky I was to have someone so patient and knowledgeable. But somewhere in our 2nd year of marriage, that contentment started feeling more like stagnation. I'd scroll through Instagram and see former classmates traveling to Italy or starting their own companies, and I'd feel this gnawing sense that we weren't living up to our potential. When I'd bring up the idea of Brooks maybe pursuing a management position at the credit union or a saving up for a bigger trip than our usual weekend camping excursions, he'd nod and say something like, "Maybe eventually, but I'm pretty happy with where we are right now." That phrase, "happy with where we are," started to grate on me. I began to see it as code for complacency, for settling, for refusing to dream bigger. I'd watch him come home from work, change into his weekend clothes and settle in with a book or work in the garden, and I'd feel frustrated by his satisfaction with what felt like such an ordinary existence. The frustration wasn't just about Brooks, though I didn't fully understand that at the time. I was struggling with my own sense of direction, watching my freelance work plateau while other designers I knew were landing corporate clients or starting agencies. There were nights when I'd lie awake next to Brooks, listening to his steady breathing, and feel this crushing weight of ordinariness pressing down on us both. I started keeping a mental tally of couples we knew who seemed to be making it buying houses, getting promotions, taking international vacations, and comparing our modest life to theirs. What made it worse was that Brooks seemed genuinely content with our routine. He'd come home from work with stories about helping a young couple qualify for their first mortgage, or how he'd figured out a way to save someone's loan application that had initially been denied. He took real pride in these small victories, and when he'd tell me about them over dinner, his face would light up in a way that I found both endearing and deeply irritating. Why couldn't he channel that same enthusiasm into something bigger, something that would advance our life together? I started dropping hints that became increasingly less subtle. I'd forward him job postings for management positions at other banks, or articles about people our age who were starting their own businesses. Brooks would thank me for thinking of him, but nothing ever came of it. When I'd ask if he'd applied for anything, he'd say he was still considering his options, but I could tell he wasn't seriously pursuing any of them. The rejection stung in a way I couldn't articulate. It felt like he was rejecting not just the opportunities, but my vision of what we could become together. The social aspect of our stagnation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. At gatherings with friends, when conversation turned to career updates and future plans, I found myself making excuses for why we hadn't bought a house yet, why Brooks hadn't been promoted, why we were taking another camping trip instead of going somewhere exotic. I started to feel embarrassed by our predictable life, ashamed of how small our dreams seemed compared to everyone else's. The worst part was that Brooks never seemed to notice or care about these social comparisons. He was perfectly comfortable being exactly who he was, regardless of how it looked to other people. Looking back, I can see that I was projecting my own restlessness and professional insecurities onto our marriage. But at the time, it felt like Brooks was holding us back, like his contentment was a form of giving up. I convinced myself that if I could just motivate him to want more, we could both break out of the rut I felt we'd fallen into. I thought I was pushing him toward his potential, but really I was pushing him away from himself. I started pushing in small ways. I'd forward him job listings for positions that paid more, or suggest we take a financial planning class so we could afford to buy a house sooner. Brooks would listen politely and then explain, very reasonably, why he thought we should stick with our current plan. He liked his coworkers, he said. He was learning a lot in his current role. We were already saving money at a good pace. Everything he said made perfect sense, which somehow made it more irritating. The tension came to a head at a dinner party thrown by my friend Rachel, who'd just gotten engaged to a guy who owned 3 rental properties. There were about 8 couples there, all people in their late 20s and early 30s, and the conversation kept turning to career moves and investment strategies. Rachel's fiancé was holding court, talking about flipping houses and side businesses, and everyone was hanging on his words like he was some kind of guru. At one point, the conversation turned to personal achievements, and people started sharing their recent wins. Someone had gotten a promotion, another couple had just bought their first house, one woman had started a successful Etsy shop. When the attention turned to our corner of the table, I felt myself tense up. What were Brooks and I going to say? That we'd successfully grown cherry tomatoes this summer. Brooks, oblivious to my anxiety, smiled and said, "Well, I guess the biggest thing for me in the past couple of years was marrying Isla. That's been pretty much the highlight." The comment was so genuine, so sweetly delivered, that several people made those awa sounds that you make when something is particularly touching. But instead of feeling flattered, I felt mortified. In a room full of people talking about professional accomplishments and financial milestones, my husband's biggest achievement was me. Without thinking, I heard myself say, "Oh, please, that's basically your only accomplishment, isn't it?" I laughed as I said it, trying to pass it off as playful teasing, but I could feel the sharpness in my own voice. The table went quiet for just a beat too long. Rachel tried to smooth things over by changing the subject, but I caught the look that passed between Brooks and me. His expression shifted from confused to hurt to something I'd never seen before: disappointment. Not just sadness, but the specific disappointment you feel when someone you trust shows you exactly how little they think of you. We barely spoke on the drive home. When we got to our house, Brooks went straight to the bathroom to brush his teeth, and I followed him, still feeling defensive and angry in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "Why are you being so weird about this?" I demanded. "It was obviously a joke." Brooks spit out his toothpaste and looked at me in the mirror. "Was it?" he asked quietly. "Of course it was. God, you're so sensitive." He turned around to face me directly. "Isla, do you actually think I haven't accomplished anything worth mentioning besides marrying you?" The honest answer was complicated. I didn't think Brooks was worthless or unsuccessful, but I did think he was underachieving. I thought he was capable of more and choosing to settle for less. And yes, in that moment, surrounded by all those people talking about their promotions and business ventures, I had felt embarrassed by his lack of conventional ambition. But I couldn't say any of that without sounding terrible, so instead I deflected. I think you could accomplish a lot more if you actually tried." That's what I think. Something shifted in Brooks's face then. It was like watching him make a decision in real time. He nodded slowly and said, "Okay, I hear you loud and clear." The next few weeks were tense but not explosive. Brooks didn't pick fights or give me the silent treatment. Instead, he seemed to withdraw into himself. He still did all his usual routines work, garden, weekend projects around the house, but there was a new distance between us. When I'd try to initiate conversations about our future or suggest activities we could do together, he'd respond politely but without enthusiasm. It was like living with a cordial roommate instead of a husband. I told myself he was being dramatic, that he'd get over it once he realized I was just trying to motivate him to be his best self. But as days turned into weeks, I started feeling increasingly frustrated by his passive response. I wanted him to fight back, to defend himself, to show some passion about something, anything. His quiet acceptance of my criticism felt like more evidence of his fundamental lack of drive. Things escalated when I started making more pointed comments about his work and our lifestyle. I'd mention how nice it must be to have such an unchallenging job, or wonder aloud what it would be like to be married to someone with bigger goals. Brooks would just nod and say something like, "I suppose everyone wants different things." His refusal to engage with my provocations made me feel crazy. I wanted a reaction, some sign that he cared enough about our relationship to fight for it. Instead, he seemed to be retreating further and further from me, which I interpreted as confirmation that he wasn't willing to put in effort when things got difficult. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd had a particularly frustrating day trying to land a bigger client for my design work, and I came home already feeling defeated and irritable. Brooks was in the kitchen making dinner, something simple with ingredients we had on hand, as usual, and something about the ordinariness of the scene just set me off. "Don't you ever want more than this?" I asked abruptly. Brooks looked up from chopping vegetables. "More than what?" "This." I gestured around our small kitchen, at the modest dinner he was preparing, at the whole unremarkable scene. "This incredibly average life we're living. Don't you ever want to do something that matters?" Brooks set down his knife and turned to face me fully. "I think this matters," he said simply. "I think coming home to you every day and making dinner together and talking about our day matters. I think the work I do at the credit union matters. I help people buy their first cars and homes. I think the garden we planted together matters. Maybe it's not fleshy, but it matters to me." His calm response made me even more angry. "That's exactly the problem," I snapped. "You're so content with mediocrity that you can't even see how much more we could have if you just tried harder. What is it you think I should be trying harder at, Isla?" "Everything. Your job, your goals, your life. You act like getting married was the finish line instead of the starting line. You act like I should be grateful to be stuck in this tiny house with someone who's completely satisfied with being ordinary." Brooks was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was very soft. "Is that really how you see our life together, as something you're stuck in?" I was too worked up to back down, even though something in his tone should have warned me to be careful. "Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I look at other couples who are building something together, who are pushing each other to grow, and I wonder what I'm doing here with someone who thinks marrying me was the biggest thing he'll ever do." The words were out before I could stop them, and as soon as I said them, I knew I'd gone too far. Brooks's face went very still, and he nodded slowly, as if something had finally clicked into place for him. "You're right," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have to settle for someone like me." He turned back to the stove and calmly turned off the burner. Then he walked past me toward the bedroom, and I heard him moving around in there, opening and closing drawers. I followed him and found him packing a bag. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to stay at my brother's place for a while," he said without looking up. "I think we both need some space to figure out what we want." I felt a surge of panic that I immediately pushed down. "Fine," I said. "Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe you'll finally realize that you can't just coast through life expecting everyone else to be satisfied with your lack of ambition." Brooks stopped packing and looked at me directly. "Isla, I need you to understand something. I never expected you to be satisfied with anything. I hoped you'd be happy, but I never thought happiness was something I could give you or take away from you. I thought it was something we'd build together." He finished packing and headed for the door. As he was leaving, he turned back and said, "For what it's worth, marrying you wasn't my only accomplishment, but it was the one I was most proud of. Past tense." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and I was alone in our house for the first time in over 2 years. The first few days after Brooks left, I felt vindicated. Finally, I thought, he was taking action instead of just passively accepting whatever life handed him. I assumed he'd come back in a week or two, ready to have a serious conversation about our future and how we could build a more ambitious life together. But a week turned into 2 weeks, and Brooks didn't come back. He texted occasionally about practical things, bills that needed to be paid, mail that was arriving for him, but he didn't suggest getting together to talk. When I finally asked when he was planning to come home, he replied that he didn't think that was a good idea right now. I started to realize that maybe I'd miscalculated. Brooks wasn't staging a dramatic gesture to get my attention. He was actually reconsidering our entire marriage. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it made me angry. How dare he give up on us just because I'd been honest about wanting more from life? I threw myself into my work, determined to prove that I could build the successful, meaningful life I'd been talking about. I reached out to bigger clients, raised my rates, and started working longer hours. Within a few weeks, I'd landed my biggest design contract, yet a complete rebrand for a regional restaurant chain. The work was challenging and well paid, and I felt a rush of satisfaction that seemed to prove I'd been right all along about the importance of ambition and growth. But success at work didn't translate into happiness at home. The house felt empty and too quiet without Brooks's steady presence. I missed the smell of whatever simple dinner he'd be making when I got home from work. I missed his terrible jokes and the way he'd absently reach for my hand while we watched TV. I missed having someone to tell about my day, someone who actually listened and asked follow-up questions. Most of all, I missed feeling like I was part of a team. Brooks had never been competitive with me or threatened by my success. He'd been genuinely excited about my new contract, proud of me in a way that felt completely supportive and unselfish. Without him there to share my wins, they felt hollow and meaningless. After a month of separation, I decided to reach out and suggest we meet for coffee to talk. Brooks agreed, but when we sat across from each other at the little place downtown where we'd had some of our early dates, he seemed like a different person. He was polite but distant, and when I started to explain how much I'd been thinking about our conversation and how maybe we could find a middle ground, he held up his hand to stop me. "Isla," he said gently, "I've been doing a lot of thinking too, and I don't think this is about finding a middle ground. I think this is about the fact that you don't actually like who I am." I started to protest, but he continued. "I'm not saying you're wrong to want different things than I want, but I need to be with someone who thinks the life I'm building is valuable, even if it's not flashy or impressive to other people. I need to be with someone who sees getting married as the beginning of something good, not as settling for something mediocre." "That's not fair," I said. "I do think you're valuable. I just think you could be doing more with your talents." Brooks smiled sadly. "But I am doing something with my talents. I'm good at my job and I help people. I'm good at growing things and I've taught you to garden. I'm good at making you laugh and taking care of the practical stuff so you can focus on your creative work. I'm good at loving you consistently and reliably. Those might not be the talents you value, but they're the ones I have." Sitting there listening to him list all the ways he'd been quietly supporting our life together, I felt something crack open in my chest. I realized that I'd been so focused on what Brooks wasn't doing that I'd completely lost sight of everything he was doing. He was right, I had stopped seeing his contributions as valuable, because they weren't the kind of contributions that impressed other people or looked good on social media. But even with that realization, I couldn't quite bring myself to admit I'd been wrong. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I just want us both to reach our full potential. Is that really such a terrible thing to want?" Brooks leaned back in his chair and studied my face. "No," he said finally, "it's not terrible to want that. But I think we have very different ideas about what reaching our full potential looks like, and I don't think I can spend my life trying to become the version of myself that would make you proud." We finished our coffee in relative silence, and when we hugged goodbye in the parking lot, I could feel that something fundamental had shifted. Brooks wasn't angry with me, but he wasn't coming home either. He'd made peace with the end of our marriage in a way that I wasn't prepared for. The divorce process was remarkably civil and painfully brief. We didn't have children or significant assets to fight over, and Brooks didn't contest anything. He moved into his own apartment across town, and we divided our belongings with the same careful consideration he'd once applied to everything else in our shared life. I kept the house and threw myself into work with even more determination. My business continued to grow, and within a year, I was making more money than I ever had before. I joined networking groups, attended industry conferences, and built the kind of professional reputation I'd always wanted. On paper, my life looked exactly like the ambitious, successful existence I dreamed of, but I was deeply, persistently lonely. I went on a few dates, but I found myself comparing every man I met to Brooks. They were either too ambitious in a way that felt competitive and exhausting, or too passive in a way that reminded me of what I'd claimed to dislike about my ex-husband. None of them had Brooks's particular combination of steadiness and warmth, his ability to be completely present without being needy or demanding. I started to understand that Brooks hadn't been lacking ambition, he'd just been ambitious about different things than I was. He'd been ambitious about creating a stable, loving home. He'd been ambitious about being good at his job and helpful to his community. He'd been ambitious about being the kind of husband who could be counted on, who would show up consistently and reliably for the woman he loved. Those had been worthy ambitions, and I dismissed them as settling for mediocrity. It's been over a year since our divorce was finalized, and I still think about Brooks regularly. I heard through mutual friends that he's been dating someone new, a woman who teaches elementary school, and apparently thinks his steady, nurturing nature is exactly what she's been looking for. The news stung in a way that surprised me with its intensity. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd responded differently that night at Rachel's party. If instead of being embarrassed by Brooks's sweet declaration that marrying me was his proudest accomplishment, I'd been touched by it. If I'd seen it as evidence of how much he valued our relationship, rather than as evidence of his lack of other achievements. I think about the man I married, and the man he probably still is someone who finds deep satisfaction in simple things, who believes that love and consistency and showing up for people is meaningful work, who would rather tend a garden than climb a corporate ladder. I think about how rare it is to find someone who approaches life with that kind of quiet integrity, and how foolish I was to mistake it for laziness or lack of vision. The irony isn't lost on me that in pushing Brooks to be more ambitious, I destroyed the thing that was actually worth being ambitious about our marriage. I got the successful career and independent life I thought I wanted, but I lost the partnership that had made all of it feel meaningful. I don't know if Brooks would ever consider giving me another chance, and honestly, I'm not sure I deserve one. I spent our entire relationship trying to change him into someone else instead of appreciating who he actually was. I treated him like a rough draft of the husband I really wanted instead of recognizing that he was already exactly the kind of man most women would consider themselves lucky to find. But I've learned something important about myself in the aftermath of our marriage. Ambition without love is just exhaustion, and success without someone to share it with is just sophisticated loneliness. Brooks understood something I didn't, that the most important accomplishments are often the most private ones. The daily choice to love someone well, to build something stable and beautiful with another person, to show up with consistency and kindness even when no one else is watching. Maybe it's too late for Brooks and me, but it's not too late for me to learn from what we had and what I threw away. The next time I find myself in love with someone who values different things than I do, I hope I'll have the wisdom to ask myself whether those differences are actually incompatibilities, or whether they're just different ways of building a meaningful life. I hope I'll remember that the best partnerships aren't about finding someone who shares all your ambitions, but about finding someone whose character you admire, whose daily presence makes your life better, and whose love feels like the kind of accomplishment worth being proud of. I hope I'll remember Brooks and the quiet way he loved me, and how foolish I was to think that wasn't enough.